Alright, so before we get into state machines, let's take a look at this simple diagram of a object, specifically JavaScript object. So when we have a JavaScript object with a key and a value, there's certain ways that we can access this value. One way using dot notation, where we can just say myObject.key, this value, and we'll access it directly. However, this way doesn't give us flexibility of dynamically getting this value. So another way is to use the square brackets and pass the key as a string. And this way we'll get this value as well. And I think in our case, what we're going to be using with the state is passing a variable that has a declared string into our object. And we'll be able to get this value as well. Here I have a new Create React app, created this moments ago. I'm gonna clean this up a little bit, so I'm gonna remove everything from the header. I'm also going to convert this class-based component to be a functional component just for the practice. Hooks just came out and I would like to get better at those. So we're gonna import useState and we're gonna convert this app into a function. I'm going to remove this render. I think this should be good. All right. So the idea behind a state machine is having an object with predetermined flow. So when we pass a state and an action specific to that state, we get a different state back. In our case, states are going to be different components that display different content. So for instance, we're going to have a home component that's responsible for displaying home content, then projects to show projects, maybe about to show about, and then contact to show contact. And we're going to have two actions, previous and next, just for the simplicity's sake. So whenever we call next, we get a next in the list state, which is going to show us different content. And that's going to be tied in with the mouse wheel events. So let's just take a look at this state machine object. I'm going to create an object called machine. Here we're going to just put in key value pairs for all our states. So first we're going to have maybe home. That's going to be landing page. Then we're going to have projects page. That's going to be a different component. Then about and maybe contact. So these are all different states. And home state is going to be our default state. So when we're going to pass a home state into this machine and an action. So here's where we're creating an action. So the action is going to be called next for this case. It doesn't have to be, we can call it whatever we want, but in this case we're just going to be calling next. And when we're going to call next, we want to return a state that's next after home. In this case would be project. We can make another action called previous, and the previous state for home, we'll just make it a circle, so it would be contact. So let's say contact. And we gonna do the same thing for each state. And this is the step where we're predetermining the flow. So this is the predetermined logic part. So when we're in projects, the next state is about. A previous state is home. Now about. The next state is contact. Previous state was projects. Projects. For contact, the next state, once again, we're just going to loop back to the front, which is going to be home. And previous state is about. Okay, so what did I do? Machine, oh, we need equal sign here. All right. So now let me destructure the useState. So we're going to create our state, set state, state, and our state is just going to contain maybe a page, and by default the page is going to be home. So now let's say we're going to have an h3. They're simply going to display our state, which is the page, state.page, and we're seeing it's home. And let's create 2 buttons. One button called next and another button called previous. And when we call next, we'll do on click. What we're going to do is we're going to set state of our application by saying set state, and we're going to say that page is going to be now. That's where we take our machine. We're going to pass a current state, which is page, which is going to be at this moment would be home. So we're passing home, as well as an action. In our case, the action is next for that button. So we call it next. Now we can do exactly the same thing for our previous, except that it's not going to call next action, it's going to call previous action. That's kind of looks strange. Let's flip-flop the buttons. There you go. So if we're correct, when we click next, we should see projects. And that's what we see. If we click next on projects, we should see about. When we click about, we should see contact, and then from contact back to home, and etc. And if we go back, we see the same flow. So that's the part where we predetermine, and since our actions happen to be all the same for each state, we don't have to manipulate any of these actions. These actions are always the same. So it's rather simple, but these actions could be called different names, but then we would have to find a way to handle different actions for those states. So keeping them the same makes it very easy for us to do that. And just thinking about it, implementing this type of flow using if statements would be rather complicated really quick. Mind you, there's some downsides to this. When we click next, let's say we're right now in about, and we click next, we're on contact. So there's 2 ways we can land on contact. We can land on contact by coming from about or coming from home. If we were on home and we said previous state, we land on contact. The application has no idea how we got to the contact. We just know that we're on contact. That's all we care about. How we got to contact is a mystery. So we're not keeping any memory how we got there. And we can implement that if it's needed, but that's one of the drawbacks of the state machines. Let's create components to represent our states that we have going on. So to not bore you with my typing, I have prepared a couple of them right here. All I'm doing is creating a very simple functional component and returning an H3 with a simple text. We're not trying to make anything complicated here. So the next step would be installing a React router. I already have it installed, but for the sake of doing this together, I'm just gonna do this fake install. So it's gonna be called React router DOM. I'm not gonna hit enter, but that's the command that's gonna install React router. And I'm just gonna restart our development server. Alrighty. And what we're gonna do is import a couple things from React router DOM. And a couple things are browser router, route, and with router. So this guy with router is going to provide us a history object that we can use to push a different location, URL location, as we're using the machine. So we'll just take a functional component. We'll create a brand new functional component. We're going to wrap it with router so that our props have this history object. We'll do this in a moment. So first thing, we're going to wrap the header div, the header element with a browser router. And browser router needs to take a single child element, kind of like older days of React before the fragments. And inside of the header, we're just gonna plop in our routes for each component, for each state. And we're also gonna do exact path. And path is gonna define our URL. So whenever this URL is current URL, we're gonna render a component. And the reason we're saying exact is that if we kept it just path without exact, the next route, for instance, if we had about here, I'm sorry, it's going to be about, an about component. If we look at this, and if we take this exact path, we're going to see both of these guys rendered. I'm going to do about. So now you see the home page and an about page. It's because I think it's relative. So it's basically checking if this includes inside of a URL. So if it's there, we're just going to render it. So by adding exact, we fix this issue and we just get a single component rendered exactly to what we're providing in this URL. All right, so let's do a couple other components. So we set projects. I believe that's what we said. Projects. Yep. About. Change this to projects. About. Make this contact. /contact. Okay, so let's just save it. Make sure things are contact. Things work. I hope. Let's see if we have any errors. Don't know why it's being slow. Alright, so we're back in working. Let's try this again. So as we're gonna navigate to projects, we're gonna see projects, contact. Alright, so everything is working as we expected. So now, what I'd like to do is create a new component that's going to handle all the logic to switch all these components with our scroll wheel. So I'm just going to make a new functional component called mouse wheel nav, make it equals to props. Now that's where we're going to wrap this guy with router. Now for the fun of it, we can just console log the props.history object. And we'll be able to see. Oh yeah, we gotta plop this guy in here. Alright, yeah, so that's our object, history object, and here's the method called push. And with push we can provide the path name. We'll be able to change this URL location by calling push. Okay, cool. So now let me, for the practice, use effect. So use effect is kind of how class-based components, component did mount and component will mount works. So basically with use effect, we can provided function. This function is gonna window.add then listener. We're gonna listen to event of mouse wheel, and we're gonna call a function called handle wheel. Now to remove this on just when we're destroying this, we have to call a return function, which is gonna do, and just copy this guy. Instead of add, do remove. Except we don't have handle wheel yet. Let's see, let's add function to handle wheel. Pass an event, return log e. Just take a look at what's going on. Let's see. Handle wheel. Oh, of course, an equal sign. All right, so now let's clear this guy. So as I'm scrolling down, what you should see is this delta y, and this delta y is positive number as I'm scrolling down. Now if I scroll up, it's going to be a negative number. So we can use this to determine if we're scrolling down or scrolling up. So if we're scrolling down, we'll use the action to call the next. If we're scrolling up, we'll do the previous. All right, so we have this working. I guess we can use state. So we're gonna use state in this guy as well. So we can destructure. I think we don't want to reuse the same names. Let's say, we'll just do state, set state. Need const before, equals use state. I'm gonna make the same structure, basically copy pasting. And we're just gonna get rid of this stuff here, so these two buttons will go away so that we don't have to worry about this, the state, and we can remove this state. It's not needed. All right, so we're good. Nothing's breaking so far. Okay, so the next step is to make this function to call next with the machine to set the state, as well as previous, and we have to wire up to use this history object to push a different, depending on which state we are, a different URL. All right, so I think the first thing we want to do is check if our event.delta y is greater than 0. If that's the case, that means we're scrolling down, which what we want to call is, we want to call a action called next. So we can do set state, and our set state is going to be page. Now that's where our machine is coming into play. Machine, which is current state, state page, and an action, which is next. And now for the sake of, instead of logging this history, we're just going to log state.page. Make sure that when we're scrolling down, we're going to set this state to the next state, and we're going to just log it. So let's do, yep, project's about. So everything as we're expected is working. So now we can add another else statement. So we can assume that if delta y is not greater than 0, so it's likely it's below 0, and in that case we can just say that we're going to call set state previous. Let's just do that, clear it up. down, up, down, up, down, up, down. Okay, so we have that working. Now, we also need to set this props to. So what we can do is to set the URL, we can do props.history.push, and we want to push to we're going to concatenate the slash plus state.page. So this is the new state that we're having. That's after it's being set. Now, mind you, we're not going to have slash home for home, but what we can do is do a little ternary expression and say, is it equals to home? If so, just return nothing, and otherwise just return state.page. Let's see if we have this working. And our home is still misbehaving. Well, let's see. Okay, so figured out. We just needed to wrap this guy in extra parentheses, and I think that fixed it. So now we can check if we're landing, if our state is home, instead of concatenating slash home, we're just returning empty string, which in turn is just a slash, and here you go, it works. So once we hit home page, it's just a slash. Okay, cool. So now I guess the only thing to kind of improve this is just to give it maybe a set timeout, so that we can't just crazy scroll and just see all the crazy state changes. So we'll just set timeout maybe a couple 100 milliseconds. Alright, so let's start with 150. We'll just pass this guy in here. And I'll just replace this as well with previous. Alright, so now, doesn't matter how crazy we go, you can see my console logs trying to debug that problem. So we could scroll 7 times and it's only going to change twice because it's preventing it to run more than once every 150 milliseconds. Okay, I think that's pretty much what I wanted to share. Hope you guys enjoyed it.